when desperate widow Margaret O'Brien whispered, "May I have your leftovers, sir?" to a well-dressed stranger outside a Nevada Territory hotel in 1869. She expected nothing more than scraps to feed her starving baby. But when millionaire Jonathan Blackwood looked into her storm-gray eyes, he saw something that would challenge everything he believed about worth, dignity, and the true meaning of wealth in the unforgiving American West. Will a moment of desperate hunger become the catalyst for a miracle that transforms two lives forever? A rattlesnake coiled in the dust just 3 feet from where Margaret O'Brien crouched behind the woodpile, its warning rattle cutting through the morning silence like broken glass. She pressed her hand over baby Catherine's mouth to muffle any sound, knowing that discovery meant more than just embarrassment. It meant losing the only shelter they'd found in 3 days of wandering through Silver Creek's back alleys. The autumn of 1869 had painted the Nevada Territory mountains in shades of gold and rust, but Margaret saw only the harsh reality of survival. Her stomach twisted with hunger so sharp it felt like someone was carving her insides with a rusty knife. The baby in her arms had stopped crying hours ago, too weak even for tears, and that silence scared Margaret more than any sound could. She watched through a gap in the wooden slats as the hotel kitchen door swung open. Steam billowed out like dragon's breath, carrying the smell of bacon and fresh biscuits that made her mouth water so fiercely she had to swallow hard to keep from being sick. A kitchen boy dumped scraps into a barrel behind the Silver Dollar Hotel, and Margaret's heart pounded as she calculated the distance. 20 feet. She could cover that ground in seconds if no one was watching. But the snake hadn't moved. Its diamond-patterned body stretched across her only path to the food scraps. Margaret had grown up on a farm back in Missouri before the fever took everyone she loved, and she knew better than to challenge a creature that could kill with a single strike. The snake's black eyes seemed to mock her desperation, as if it understood that she was trapped between hunger and death. A church bell chimed 9 times across town, each ring echoing off the wooden buildings that lined Silver Creek's dusty main street. Margaret knew the sound meant the breakfast crowd would soon emerge from the hotel, well-fed men and women who would see her ragged dress and dirty face and cross to the other side of the street. She'd learned in her weeks of wandering that poverty made people uncomfortable, as if bad luck might be catching. The kitchen door opened again, and this time a woman in a crisp white apron stepped out. She was older, with gray hair pulled back tight and flour dusting her thick forearms. The cook looked directly at the woodpile where Margaret hid, and for a heart-stopping moment, their eyes met through the gap in the boards. Margaret held her breath, certain she'd been discovered. Catherine stirred restlessly in her arms, and Margaret bounced her gently, praying the baby wouldn't cry out. The cook studied the woodpile for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, then did something unexpected. She set a plate of leftover biscuits on the ground near the barrel and went back inside without a word. The snake slithered away into the brush, as if it too understood that some moments required mercy instead of menace. Margaret waited until she was sure the coast was clear, then crept forward on shaking legs. The biscuits were still warm, and she stuffed one whole into her mouth before remembering to save some for Catherine. She chewed the soft bread into mush and fed it to the baby with her finger, watching color return to the tiny face. As she ate, Margaret caught her reflection in a rain puddle left from the previous night's storm. The woman staring back looked like a stranger. Hollow cheeks, dark circles under eyes that had once been bright with dreams of a teaching position out west. Her blonde hair hung in tangles, and her dress, once a cheerful blue, was now stained with mud and worse things she didn't want to think about. A group of well-dressed travelers emerged from the hotel's front entrance, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. The men wore fine black coats and polished boots that had never walked a mile of rough ground. The women clutched silk parasols and spoke in the kind of refined voices that belonged in drawing rooms, not frontier towns. Margaret pressed herself deeper into the shadows, knowing that people like these lived in a world so different from hers that they might as well be creatures from another planet. One man separated from the group, walking with the confident stride of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. He carried a leather portfolio and checked a gold pocket watch that probably cost more than Margaret had ever seen in one place. When he settled at a table in the hotel's outdoor dining area, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. a recognition that this moment might be her chance to ask for help from someone who clearly had more than enough. But asking meant admitting defeat, and Margaret O'Brien had been raised to believe that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. Her mother had scrubbed floors until her hands bled to keep food on their table. Her father had worked 16-hour days in the fields until his heart gave out from the strain. Begging felt like betraying everything they had taught her about dignity and self-reliance. The man ordered breakfast in a voice that carried the smooth edges of expensive education. Margaret watched him spread papers across the table and begin writing with a fountain pen that caught the morning sunlight. He ate slowly, the way people do when they've never wondered where their next meal might come from, and left half his food untouched on the plate. That wasted food might as well have been gold coins scattered in the dust. Margaret stood up slowly. Catherine clutched against her chest and stepped out of the shadows. Her legs trembled with more than hunger as she approached the outdoor dining area, knowing that the next few minutes would either save them or destroy what remained of her pride. The man looked up as her shadow fell across his papers, and Margaret found herself staring into dark eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed mask of composure. This close, she could smell his expensive cologne and see the fine stitching on his coat that spoke of custom tailoring. Everything about him screamed wealth and privilege, while everything about her whispered desperation and defeat. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, the words sticking in her throat like thorns. How did a woman who had once taught school children and dreamed of making a difference in the world ask a stranger for table scraps? How did she explain that she had fallen so far that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford? The baby stirred in her arms, letting out a weak cry that seemed to echo across the empty space between her old life and this moment of reckoning. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" The words tumbled out of Margaret's mouth like water bursting through a broken dam, desperate and unstoppable. The gentleman's dark eyes widened in surprise, his fountain pen freezing halfway through a signature. Around them, the morning bustle of Silver Creek continued. Horses clip-clopping down the main street, shopkeepers sweeping their front steps, children racing toward the schoolhouse with lunch pails clanging. But in the small circle of the hotel's outdoor dining area, time seemed to stop completely. Jonathan Nathaniel Blackwood had expected many things when he traveled west to inspect mining investments, but a young woman with a baby asking for his breakfast scraps wasn't one of them. He set down his pen with careful precision, buying himself time to process what he was seeing. The woman standing beside his table wore a dress that had once been fine quality, though now it hung loose on her thin frame. Her blonde hair was clean but simply braided, and her green eyes held a mixture of desperation and defiance that caught him off guard. "I beg your pardon?" Jonathan's Boston accent sounded foreign in the high desert air, each carefully pronounced syllable marking him as clearly as if he wore a sign declaring his wealth. Margaret's cheeks burned red, but she didn't step away from the table. "Your breakfast, sir. If you're finished with it." She shifted the bundle in her arms, and Jonathan glimpsed a tiny face, pale as winter moonlight. "For my daughter. She's hungry." The baby chose that moment to let out a thin wail that seemed to pierce straight through Jonathan's chest. He'd heard crying children before, of course, but this sound was different. Weaker, more desperate. The cry of a child whose body was running out of strength to protest its circumstances. "When did you last eat?" The question escaped before Jonathan could consider whether it was appropriate to ask such a personal thing of a stranger. Margaret's chin lifted in a gesture that spoke of pride worn thin but not yet broken. "That's not your concern, sir. I'm not asking for charity." Her voice carried the faint trace of Missouri hills, softened by education but hardened by recent trials. "Just what you won't finish." Jonathan studied the remains of his meal with new eyes. The thick slices of ham, the eggs cooked exactly how he'd requested, the fresh bread still warm from the hotel's kitchen. It was more food than this woman had probably seen in days, and he'd barely touched half of it. Back in Boston, he might leave such a breakfast without a second thought, knowing another would appear at the ring of a bell. But this wasn't Boston, and the woman standing before him wasn't asking for money or favors. She was asking for food he was about to abandon, and there was something about her careful phrasing, "what you won't finish," that suggested she'd thought long and hard about how to make this request without sacrificing every last shred of her dignity. "Please sit down," Jonathan said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Margaret glanced around the dining area, noting how the other guests had begun to stare. A woman dining alone with a strange man, especially a woman in her circumstances, would set tongues wagging faster than a telegraph could carry news. "I shouldn't," she said, but her legs were shaking so badly she wasn't sure she could remain standing much longer. "I insist." Jonathan's voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to having his requests honored. "You're clearly exhausted, and the baby needs tending." Against her better judgment, Margaret sank into the offered chair. The relief of sitting down was so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She tried to arrange herself properly, smoothing her wrinkled skirt and adjusting Catherine's blankets. But there was no hiding the fact that she looked like what she was, a woman who had been sleeping rough and eating scraps when she could find them. Jonathan signaled to a passing waiter. "Fresh milk for the baby, and perhaps some soft bread." He looked back at Margaret. "I assume you're nursing?" The personal nature of the question should have embarrassed her, but Margaret was beyond such concerns. "When I can," she admitted quietly. "It's been difficult." The waiter brought milk in a small pitcher and a basket of warm rolls. Margaret tore a piece of bread into tiny bits, soaking them in milk until they were soft enough for Catherine to gum down. The baby ate eagerly, tiny hands grasping at the food with desperate hunger that made Jonathan's chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. While Catherine fed, Margaret allowed herself to eat with more restraint, taking small bites of the eggs and ham Jonathan pushed toward her. Each mouthful seemed to bring color back to her pale cheeks, and Jonathan found himself watching her transformation with fascination. This was a woman who had clearly known better times, educated and refined despite her current circumstances. "You're not from Silver Creek," Jonathan observed, noting the way she held her fork and the careful way she dabbed her mouth with the napkin. "Missouri originally," Margaret replied between careful bites. "My husband and I came west after." She paused, and Jonathan saw grief flicker across her features like shadow across water. "After we lost our farm to debt. He heard there were opportunities here, jobs for those willing to work hard. And now," Margaret's laugh held no humor, "now I'm discovering that opportunity has conditions most people don't mention. A woman alone with a baby isn't exactly what employers have in mind when they post notices for workers." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and both of them looked up at clouds gathering over the mountains. The morning sunshine was giving way to the kind of gray sky that promised serious weather, the kind that could turn Silver Creek's dusty streets into rivers of mud. "Where are you staying?" Jonathan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Margaret's silence confirmed his suspicions. She finished feeding Catherine and wrapped the baby more tightly in her thin blanket, preparing to face whatever came next. "Thank you for the food," she said formally, starting to rise from her chair. "You've been very kind." But Jonathan wasn't ready to let her disappear back into the maze of alleys and abandoned buildings where desperate people tried to make homes out of nothing. Something about this woman, her dignity in the face of degradation, her fierce protectiveness of her child, the intelligence that sparkled in her eyes despite her circumstances, had awakened something in him that had been sleeping for far too long. "Wait," he said, and the word carried more weight than either of them expected. Lightning split the Nevada sky like a giant's whip crack, and Margaret clutched Catherine closer as the first fat raindrops splattered against the hotel's wooden porch. Within seconds, the gentle autumn shower transformed into a furious downpour that sent other diners scrambling for the safety of indoor tables. Jonathan watched Margaret's thin shawl darken with moisture, noting how she instinctively curved her body around the baby to protect Catherine from the driving rain. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint that spoke of more than just cold. This was the pallor of someone whose body had been pushed to its limits and beyond. "You can't stay out here," Jonathan said, raising his voice above the storm's roar. "The baby will catch her death." Margaret pressed her back against the hotel's log wall, trying to find shelter in the narrow overhang. But the wind drove the rain sideways, soaking through her worn boots and making her skirt cling to her legs like ice-cold hands. "We'll manage," she replied through chattering teeth, though even she could hear how unconvincing the words sounded. The hotel's other guests had long since fled indoors, leaving only Jonathan and Margaret on the covered porch. Through the amber-lit windows, they could see well-dressed travelers dining on roasted beef and apple pie, their faces glowing with warmth and satisfaction. The contrast between that comfortable scene and Margaret's desperate situation struck Jonathan like a physical blow. A particularly violent gust of wind sent a spray of rainwater across the porch, and Catherine began to cry. Not the weak mewling she'd made earlier, but the lusty wail of a baby whose discomfort had overcome her exhaustion. Margaret bounced her frantically, but her own shivering made it impossible to provide the steady comfort the child needed. "This is ridiculous," Jonathan muttered, making a decision that surprised even him. "There's a room upstairs. Nothing improper about it. Just somewhere dry and warm." Margaret's green eyes flashed with something between gratitude and terror. She'd learned in her weeks of desperation that kindness from strangers often came with strings attached, and a wealthy man offering shelter to a defenseless woman usually meant only one thing. "I won't be anyone's kept woman," she said firmly, despite the way her voice shook with cold. "I'm not suggesting anything of the sort," Jonathan replied, and something in his tone convinced her he was telling the truth. "I'm suggesting that letting a baby freeze to death on a hotel porch would be unconscionable, and any man who would take advantage of such circumstances would be lower than a snake." Thunder crashed overhead so loudly that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Margaret looked down at Catherine, whose tiny face was now red with crying and cold, and felt her resolve crumble like a dam in a flash flood. Pride was a luxury she'd clung to for weeks, but watching her daughter suffer for the sake of her mother's dignity finally broke something inside her. "All right," she whispered, the words barely audible above the storm. Jonathan led them through the hotel's warmly lit lobby, past curious stares from guests, who clearly wondered what a well-dressed gentleman was doing with a bedraggled woman and crying baby. The hotel clerk, a thin man with spectacles and a disapproving frown, started to object, but something in Jonathan's expression made him think better of it. The room Jonathan secured was on the second floor, small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a washstand that gleamed white against the log walls. A pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated blessed warmth, and Margaret nearly wept with relief as the heat began to penetrate her chilled bones. "I'll arrange for a crib," Jonathan said, but Margaret was already settling onto the floor near the stove, unwrapping Catherine's damp blankets with practiced efficiency. "She's used to sleeping with me," Margaret explained, not meeting his eyes. "Keeps us both warmer." Jonathan watched her tend to the baby with movements that spoke of months of practice at making do with nothing. She had no extra clothes to change Catherine into, so she simply held the damp blankets near the stove until the heat dried them enough to wrap around the child again. It was a heartbreaking display of maternal resourcefulness born from necessity. While Margaret focused on Catherine, Jonathan found himself studying the woman who had stumbled into his carefully ordered life like a whirlwind. Her dress, now that he could see it clearly in the lamplight, had once been expensive, the kind of garment a prosperous farmer's wife might wear to church on Sundays. The fabric was good quality, and the stitching spoke of skilled hands, either her own or those of a professional seamstress. "You weren't always," Jonathan began, then stopped, unsure how to phrase the question without causing offense. "Poor." Margaret's laugh held no bitterness, only a weary acceptance that made Jonathan's chest ache. "No, Mr. Blackwood. I wasn't always digging through garbage for my supper." The fact that she knew his name startled him. "How did you?" "Hotel registry book," Margaret explained, settling Catherine against her shoulder. "I saw it when we came through the lobby. Jonathan Nathaniel Blackwood of Boston, Massachusetts. Staying in the finest suite the Silver Dollar has to offer." There was no accusation in her voice, but Jonathan felt the weight of their different circumstances settle between them like a stone wall. He owned railroads and mining interests worth more than most people would see in a lifetime, while she was grateful for leftover breakfast scraps. The distance between their worlds seemed impossible to bridge. "Tell me what happened," Jonathan said quietly, settling into the room's single chair. "To bring you here, I mean." Margaret was quiet for so long that he thought she wouldn't answer. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Silver Creek, rattling windows and sending streams of water cascading from the hotel's roof. Finally, she began to speak in a voice so soft he had to lean forward to hear her. "My husband Daniel was a good man," she said, stroking Catherine's thin hair. "A teacher like me. We had a small farm outside Springfield, nothing fancy, but it was ours. When the war ended, we thought the hard times were over." She paused, and Jonathan saw her throat work as she swallowed difficult memories. Then the fever came, swept through Missouri like wildfire that summer. Took my parents first, then Daniel's. We used everything we had paying for medicine, for doctors trying to save them. The baby had finally settled into sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm that parents learn to treasure. Margaret adjusted her position carefully, mindful not to wake the child. "Daniel got sick in October," she continued. "By then, we'd lost the farm to pay the medical bills. I was carrying Catherine, and Daniel was—" Her voice broke slightly. "He lasted until she was born. Got to hold her once. Said she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Then he was gone." Jonathan found himself gripping the arms of his chair, imagining this refined woman watching everything she loved slip away like sand through her fingers. In Boston, death from fever was rare, contained by modern medicine and careful quarantine. But on the frontier, disease could destroy entire families in a matter of weeks. "The church ladies tried to help," Margaret went on, "but they had their own troubles. Someone mentioned that Silver Creek needed teachers, that there were opportunities out west for those willing to work. So I sold what little we had left and bought passage on the train." "But there was no teaching position," Jonathan guessed. Margaret's bitter smile confirmed his suspicion. "Oh, there was a position. For a man. A single man who could maintain discipline in a classroom full of rough mining camp children. A woman with a baby wasn't exactly what they had in mind." The injustice of it struck Jonathan like a physical blow. Here was an educated woman, clearly capable and intelligent, reduced to begging for scraps because society had decided that her circumstances made her unemployable. It was the kind of systematic cruelty that masqueraded as proper moral order, and it made him angry in ways he hadn't expected. Outside, the storm began to ease, the thunder moving off toward distant mountains. But inside the small room, the weight of Margaret's story hung between them like a challenge neither was quite ready to face. "You're going to catch pneumonia if you keep pacing like that," Margaret observed from her seat on the floor beside the stove, where she was mending a torn seam in Catherine's tiny dress using thread she'd carefully pulled from her own petticoat. Jonathan paused in his restless circuit of the small room, suddenly aware that he'd been walking back and forth for the better part of an hour while his mind wrestled with problems that had no easy solutions. Through the window, Silver Creek's main street glistened with puddles that reflected the afternoon sun, and the air carried the clean smell of rain-washed earth. "I've been thinking about your situation," Jonathan said, settling into the room's single chair with the careful movements of a man trying to convince himself he wasn't about to do something completely mad. Margaret looked up from her sewing, wariness flickering across her features like candlelight. "Mr. Blackwood, if you're about to offer me charity again—" "Not charity," Jonathan interrupted. "Employment. Real employment with wages and responsibilities and everything proper." The needle stilled in Margaret's hands. "What kind of employment?" Jonathan pulled a leather portfolio from his traveling case and spread several documents across the small table. "I came to Silver Creek to assess mining investments, but my business interests are extensive. Railroad development, land acquisition, supply chain management for frontier settlements. I need someone who can handle correspondence, maintain accurate records, and help me understand local conditions that might affect my investments." Margaret set down her sewing and moved closer to examine the papers. Even from her position on the floor, she could see columns of figures that represented more money than she'd ever imagined. Contracts for steel and lumber and machinery that would reshape the landscape of the Nevada Territory. "You want me to be your secretary," she said slowly. "I want you to be my business partner," Jonathan corrected, surprising himself with the words. You understand this region in ways I never will. You've lived through the reality of what it means to survive out here, to build something from nothing. That perspective is worth more than all the investment reports my Boston associates could provide. Catherine stirred in her makeshift bed near the stove, making the soft murmuring sounds babies make when they're dreaming. Margaret moved to check on her, using the moment to process what Jonathan was offering. Partnership with a millionaire wasn't something she'd ever imagined. But then again, nothing about her life had followed the path she'd expected. What would people say? Margaret asked, voicing the concern that had been nagging at her since Jonathan first showed her kindness. A single woman working closely with an unmarried man? The scandal would destroy both our reputations. Jonathan had considered this problem as well, and his solution was characteristically direct. Then we won't be unmarried, he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun, impossible to take back once spoken. Margaret stared at him, searching his face for signs of jest or deception, but finding only the steady resolve of a man who had made a decision and intended to see it through. Are you proposing to me? Margaret's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. I'm proposing a partnership that would benefit us both, Jonathan replied carefully. You need security and independence. I need someone who understands the realities of frontier life and can help me make sound investment decisions. Marriage would provide the social legitimacy necessary for us to work together without scandal. It was the most businesslike marriage proposal in the history of romance, and Margaret found herself both impressed and slightly hurt by its practical nature. There was no declaration of love, no pretty speeches about destiny or divine providence. Just a logical arrangement between two people who could help each other survive in a world that seemed determined to grind them down. And Catherine, Margaret asked, glancing toward her sleeping daughter. Would become my daughter in every way that matters, Jonathan answered without hesitation. I may not know much about children, but I'm willing to learn. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, followed by the voice of the hotel clerk. Mr. Blackwood? There's a gentleman downstairs asking for you. Says it's urgent business. Jonathan frowned, checking his pocket watch. He wasn't expecting any visitors, and urgent business usually meant problems with his investments. Tell him I'll be down shortly, he called back, then turned to Margaret. I'm sorry, I have to handle this, but think about what I've said. Margaret nodded, still reeling from the conversation's unexpected turn. I will. Jonathan gathered his papers and headed for the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Margaret, whatever you decide, you and Catherine are welcome to stay here as long as you need. No conditions, no expectations. I just want you to be safe. After he left, Margaret sank onto the bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind spinning with possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. Marriage to Jonathan would solve her immediate problems. Food, shelter, security for Catherine. But it would also mean binding her life to a man she barely knew, trusting her future to someone whose world was so different from hers they might as well speak different languages. Catherine woke with a soft cry, and Margaret scooped her up, settling by the window to nurse while she watched the activity on the street below. Silver Creek was a town balanced on the edge of civilization, full of people trying to build something lasting in a place that could change overnight. Perhaps that made it the perfect setting for the kind of partnership Jonathan was proposing. Two people creating something new from the ruins of their separate pasts. Downstairs in the hotel lobby, Jonathan faced a different kind of uncertainty. The man waiting for him was Harrison Caldwell, his father's former business partner and current member of the Boston investment consortium that funded Jonathan's Western ventures. Caldwell's presence in Silver Creek meant only one thing: trouble. Jonathan, my boy, Caldwell boomed, his voice carrying the authority of old money and older traditions. Didn't expect to find you playing house in a frontier hotel. The board is asking questions about your extended stay in this godforsaken territory. Jonathan felt his carefully constructed world begin to shift beneath his feet. Harrison, what brings you to Silver Creek? Caldwell's smile held no warmth. You do, actually. 3 months of mining reports that show marginal profits at best, and rumors that you've become distracted by local interests. The board wants answers, Jonathan. They want to know if their investment in your judgment was wise. Through the lobby's windows, Jonathan could see storm clouds gathering again over the distant mountains. But the real storm, he realized, was just beginning to break over his head. The telegram crinkled like autumn leaves in Harrison Caldwell's thick fingers as he read its contents aloud in the hotel lobby, each word falling like hammer blows on Jonathan's carefully constructed plans. Board meeting scheduled November 15th. Your immediate return required to address concerns regarding investment decisions and personal conduct. Failure to appear will result in removal from all positions. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face as the implications hit him like a runaway stagecoach. November 15th was only 2 weeks away. Barely enough time to travel back to Boston, let alone resolve the complicated situation he'd created in Silver Creek. Around them, the hotel lobby buzzed with the usual frontier activity, but Jonathan felt as if he were standing in the eye of a hurricane, watching his world spin apart. Personal conduct? Jonathan repeated, his voice carefully controlled. What exactly are they implying, Harrison? Caldwell folded the telegram with deliberate precision, his gray eyes never leaving Jonathan's face. They're implying that a man who disappears into the wilderness for months on end, sending back reports about questionable mining ventures while apparently living in sin with some frontier woman, might not have the judgment necessary to manage family investments worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke, and Jonathan felt his temper flare in ways it hadn't since his school days. I'm not living in sin with anyone, he said through gritted teeth. Mrs. O'Brien is a respectable widow who has been assisting me with business matters. Ah yes, the mysterious Mrs. O'Brien. Caldwell's smile held all the warmth of a snake preparing to strike. Widowed, destitute, traveling with an infant child. How very convenient for a man looking for companionship in the wilderness. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment he seriously considered striking a man 20 years his senior. The fact that Caldwell had somehow learned details about Margaret's situation meant he'd been asking questions around town, spreading poison that could destroy her reputation along with Jonathan's. Choose your next words very carefully, Harrison, Jonathan warned, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made the older man step back slightly. But before Caldwell could respond, a commotion erupted near the hotel's front entrance. The door burst open with such force that it banged against the wall, and 3 rough-looking men stumbled inside, their clothes dusty from hard riding and their faces grim with purpose. The leader, a scarred man with a deputy's badge pinned crookedly to his vest, scanned the lobby until his eyes fixed on Jonathan. You Jonathan Blackwood? The deputy demanded, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. I am, Jonathan replied warily, wondering what fresh disaster was about to crash down on his head. Got a warrant here for the arrest of one Margaret O'Brien, the deputy announced, pulling a folded paper from his shirt pocket. Fraud, theft, and abandonment of legal obligations. She's wanted back in Missouri for questioning. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Around the lobby, conversations stopped as guests turned to stare at the unfolding drama. Even Caldwell looked genuinely surprised, though Jonathan caught a flicker of satisfaction in the older man's eyes that suggested this development might not be entirely unwelcome. There must be some mistake, Jonathan said, though his mind was already racing through the implications. Mrs. O'Brien is a respectable woman who— Mrs. O'Brien is a fugitive from justice, the deputy interrupted. Got word she was traveling with a baby. Matches the description we received from Springfield. Now where is she? Jonathan's throat felt dry as dust. Margaret was upstairs in his room, probably still deciding whether to accept his marriage proposal. Completely unaware that armed men were hunting her for crimes he couldn't even imagine her committing. The irony was bitter. He'd offered her marriage to provide legitimacy and protection, only to discover she might need protection from the law itself. I demand to see that warrant, Jonathan said, stalling for time while his mind raced through options that all seemed to lead to disaster. The deputy handed over the document with obvious reluctance, and Jonathan scanned its contents with growing disbelief. According to the charges, Margaret had stolen money from the Springfield Ladies' Aid Society, forged documents to secure train passage under false pretenses, and abandoned legal debts totaling more than $300. "This is preposterous," Jonathan said, though doubt was already creeping into his voice like poison ivy. How well did he really know Margaret O'Brien? She'd appeared in his life like a ghost, desperate and mysterious, with a story that tugged at his heartstrings but few details that could be verified. What if her tale of tragic loss was just another performance, designed to ensnare a wealthy man's sympathy? "Law's the law," the deputy replied with a shrug. "Now, you going to tell us where she is? Or do we need to search this place room by room?" Caldwell stepped forward with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Gentlemen, perhaps we can resolve this matter quietly. Mr. Blackwood here is a prominent Boston investor, and I'm sure he had no idea he was harboring a criminal. If you could give us a moment to locate the woman." The suggestion made Jonathan's skin crawl, but he also recognized the wisdom in buying time. If Margaret was truly innocent, and every instinct he possessed insisted she must be, then she deserved a chance to explain before being dragged away in chains. If she was guilty, well, that was a possibility he wasn't ready to consider. 10 minutes, the deputy agreed grudgingly. "Then we tear this place apart." As the lawmen settled into chairs near the lobby entrance to wait, Jonathan felt the walls of his carefully ordered world closing in around him. Upstairs, Margaret was probably still nursing Catherine by the window, trusting that the man who'd offered her partnership and protection could actually deliver on his promises. But how could he protect her from charges that might be legitimate? How could he risk his entire future on a woman he'd known for less than a day? Caldwell placed a heavy hand on Jonathan's shoulder, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "This is your chance, my boy. Cut ties with this woman now, come back to Boston where you belong, and we can put this whole unfortunate episode behind us. The board will understand that you were deceived by a clever criminal." The older man's words made perfect sense from a business perspective. Margaret's arrest would solve Jonathan's immediate problems with the board, while freeing him from entanglements that could destroy his reputation. All he had to do was step aside and let justice take its course. But as Jonathan stared at the warrant in his hands, he found himself thinking not about business logic or social expectations, but about the way Margaret had held her daughter during the storm, protecting Catherine with her own body even when she was too weak to protect herself. He thought about her quiet dignity when asking for table scraps, her fierce pride even in desperation, her intelligent observations about frontier economics that had impressed him more than any Harvard-educated consultant ever had. The clock on the lobby wall ticked toward their deadline with relentless precision, each second bringing them closer to a moment when Jonathan would have to choose between the safe path that led back to his old life and the dangerous road that led toward an uncertain future with a woman who might be everything she seemed, or nothing at all. Margaret was humming softly to Catherine when the footsteps thundered up the hotel stairs, too heavy and too fast to belong to Jonathan returning from his business meeting. She pressed her ear to the door and heard hushed voices in the hallway, multiple men discussing room numbers and search procedures in the clipped tones of law enforcement. Her blood turned to ice water as she recognized the words warrant and arrest filtering through the thin wooden walls. Without fully understanding why, Margaret knew they were coming for her, and every survival instinct she'd developed during her weeks on the frontier screamed at her to run. Moving with the silent efficiency of desperation, Margaret gathered Catherine's few belongings and wrapped the baby tightly in her warmest blanket. The window overlooked a steep drop to the alley behind the hotel, but there was a narrow ledge that connected to the roof of the adjacent building. It was the kind of escape route that would have been impossible to attempt in her former life as a respectable teacher's wife, but desperation had taught her capabilities she'd never known she possessed. The voices in the hallway grew closer, and Margaret heard Jonathan's distinctive Boston accent mixed with rougher frontier voices. She couldn't make out the words, but the tension in the conversation was unmistakable. Whatever was happening, Jonathan was trying to buy her time, though she couldn't understand why he would risk himself for someone he barely knew. Margaret eased the window open just as heavy boots stopped outside her door. The October air bit at her face like invisible teeth, and the ledge looked even narrower from this angle, barely wide enough for one person to edge along sideways. But Catherine's life depended on her mother's courage, and Margaret had learned that motherhood could make a woman capable of miracles. "Mrs. O'Brien?" A gruff voice called through the door. "This is Deputy Marshal Webb. We need to speak with you about some matters back in Missouri." Missouri. The word hit Margaret like a physical blow, bringing back memories she'd spent months trying to bury. The Ladies' Aid Society money that had mysteriously disappeared. The train tickets she'd bought with funds that weren't technically hers to use. The debts she'd left behind when grief and desperation drove her westward. She hadn't stolen anything. The money had been given to her by Mrs. Henderson as payment for nursing the woman's sick children through scarlet fever. But she'd taken it without waiting for the society's formal approval, and she'd used false papers to secure passage when her real identity was connected to too many unpaid bills. In the eyes of the law, those actions probably qualified as fraud and theft, regardless of her motivations. The doorknob rattled as someone tested the lock, and Margaret knew she was out of time. Clutching Catherine against her chest, she swung one leg over the windowsill and began the terrifying journey along the ledge toward uncertain safety. The wind this high up was fierce, tugging at her skirts and threatening to unbalance her with every step. Below, the alley yawned like an open grave, and Margaret forced herself not to look down as she inched sideways along the narrow wooden planks. Catherine remained miraculously quiet, perhaps sensing her mother's need for absolute silence. Behind her, the hotel room door burst open with a crash of splintering wood. Angry voices erupted as the lawmen discovered their quarry had flown, and Margaret heard the heavy footsteps of men searching the room for clues to her escape route. The open window would give away her path within seconds, but by then she'd reached the relative safety of the neighboring building's roof. From her perch atop the general store, Margaret could see the chaos unfolding in the hotel below. Through windows, she glimpsed Jonathan being questioned by the deputy. His face pale but his posture defiant as he clearly refused to cooperate with their investigation. The sight filled her with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. This good man was risking his reputation to protect a woman who was exactly the kind of criminal the law said she was. Margaret knew she should run. Silver Creek was surrounded by wilderness where a woman could disappear completely, living off the land until the law moved on to other concerns. But watching Jonathan defend her honor while she hid on a rooftop like a common thief filled her with shame that cut deeper than any physical wound. She thought about the proposal he'd made just hours earlier: partnership, marriage, legitimacy for herself, and a father for Catherine. It had seemed like a miracle, too good to be true, and now she understood why. Men like Jonathan Blackwood didn't marry women like her. Women with secrets and warrants and pasts that could destroy everything they touched. The deputy marshal emerged from the hotel, his face red with frustration as he barked orders to his men. They would search the town systematically, questioning every person who might have seen her, checking every building where a woman with a baby could hide. Margaret had maybe an hour before they expanded their search to include the rooftops, and after that, capture was inevitable. But as she watched the scene below, Margaret noticed something that made her heart race with hope. Jonathan wasn't just being questioned, he was being arrested. The deputy had produced handcuffs and was reading charges that carried clearly across the still air. Harboring a fugitive, obstruction of justice, interfering with a lawful arrest. The man who had offered her everything was now losing his freedom because he'd chosen to protect her. And Margaret realized that running away would make his sacrifice meaningless while confirming every suspicion about her character. Slowly, carefully, Margaret began making her way back toward the hotel's window. Catherine stirred restlessly in her arms, perhaps sensing the decision that would determine all their futures. Below in the street, the deputy's men continued their search, unaware that their quarry was preparing to surrender herself on her own terms. Margaret had spent months learning that survival sometimes required desperate choices. But watching Jonathan face arrest rather than betray her trust had taught her something more important, that some things mattered more than survival. Honor mattered, truth mattered, and sometimes, facing your past with dignity was the only way to build a future worth having. As she reached the hotel window, Margaret could hear voices in the hallway again. The deputy demanding answers from Jonathan, threatening him with federal charges if he didn't cooperate. The sound of a good man being destroyed for her sake was more than she could bear. Taking a deep breath that might be her last as a free woman, Margaret climbed through the window and walked toward the door, ready to face whatever consequences awaited a desperate mother who had made desperate choices in desperate times. The jail cell door slammed shut with a clang that echoed through Margaret's bones like a death knell, but she barely noticed the sound because Jonathan was staring at her through the iron bars with an expression of complete bewilderment. "What in God's name are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice hoarse from arguing with the deputy marshal for the past hour. Margaret shifted Catherine to her other arm, the baby's weight seeming heavier in the dim confines of Silver Creek's tiny jail. "I couldn't let you face charges for protecting me," she said simply, settling onto the narrow wooden bench that served as the cell's only furniture. "Not when I'm exactly what they say I am." Deputy Marshal Webb locked the cell with obvious satisfaction, his scarred face creasing into something that might have been a smile on a less weathered man. Well, looks like the lady has a conscience after all. Makes my job a whole lot easier when criminals turn themselves in." The jail consisted of 2 cells separated by a narrow corridor that reeked of unwashed bodies and despair. Through the single-barred window, Margaret could see Silver Creek's main street, where life continued its normal rhythm despite the drama unfolding in the town's makeshift courthouse. Children ran past chasing a hoop, minors trudged toward the saloons for their evening drinks, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell told the hour with mournful precision. "You didn't steal anything," Jonathan said firmly, gripping the bars between their cells. "I know you, Margaret. You're not a thief." Margaret's laugh held no humor, only the bitter recognition of a woman who had finally stopped running from her past. "I took money that wasn't mine to take. I used false papers to buy train tickets. I left debts unpaid when I fled Missouri." She looked down at Catherine, who was sleeping peacefully despite the chaos surrounding them. "The law doesn't care about my reasons, Jonathan. It only cares about my actions." Through the corridor's grimy window, Margaret could see Harrison Caldwell pacing back and forth in front of the sheriff's office, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as clearly out of place in Silver Creek's rough frontier setting. Every few minutes, he would pull out his pocket watch and frown at it, obviously calculating how this delay would affect his plans to drag Jonathan back to Boston. "Tell me what really happened," Jonathan said quietly, his earlier anger giving way to the careful attention of a man trying to solve a complex problem. "The whole truth, Margaret. If I'm going to help you, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the jail settling around them. Somewhere in the building, she could hear the deputy talking to someone about telegraphing Missouri for additional charges, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had successfully closed a difficult case. "Mrs. Henderson's children were dying," Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scarlet fever. The doctor said there was nothing he could do, that I should prepare for the worst. But I'd seen the fever before back when I was teaching. I knew what to do." She shifted Catherine again, the familiar weight of her daughter providing comfort in the strange surroundings. "I nursed those children for 3 weeks, stayed by their bedsides day and night, fed them broth when they could barely swallow, bathed them with cool cloths when the fever spiked. All 3 of them lived." Jonathan leaned against the bars, his dark eyes focused intently on her face. "And Mrs. Henderson paid you for your work." "More than paid me," Margaret corrected. "She was so grateful that she gave me $200 from the Ladies' Aid Society Fund. Said it was money set aside for emergencies, and saving her children's lives qualified as the greatest emergency she could imagine." The confession hung between them like smoke, and Margaret could see Jonathan's legal mind working through the implications. Taking money from a charity fund, even with permission from one member, could easily be construed as theft if the organization hadn't formally approved the payment. "But you didn't wait for official approval," Jonathan guessed. Margaret shook her head, remembering the desperation that had driven her decisions. Daniel was already sick by then. The medical bills were piling up faster than snow in a blizzard, and the bank was threatening to foreclose on the farm. When Mrs. Henderson offered that money, it seemed like a gift from heaven. A commotion outside interrupted her story. Through the window, Margaret could see a crowd gathering in the street, their voices rising in animated discussion. The jail's front door opened with a bang, and Deputy Webb entered with two men Margaret recognized from her brief time in Silver Creek, the hotel clerk and the general store owner. "These gentlemen have some interesting things to say about your lady friend," Webb announced to Jonathan with obvious pleasure. "Seems she's been asking a lot of questions around town. Questions about mining claims and railroad investments and who might be interested in buying up property on the cheap." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she realized how her innocent inquiries must have appeared to suspicious frontier minds. She'd been trying to help Jonathan understand local economic conditions, but to others, her questions might have seemed like the work of a confidence artist gathering information for some elaborate swindle. "That's ridiculous," Jonathan protested, but Margaret could see doubt creeping into his expression. How well did he really know her? They'd met just days ago under circumstances that could easily have been manufactured by a clever criminal looking to exploit a wealthy man's sympathy. The hotel clerk, a thin man with nervous hands, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "She had me show her the registry book, Mr. Blackwood. Ask specifically about your room, your length of stay, your business in Silver Creek. And she paid for the information with a gold coin that looked mighty old and valuable for a woman claiming to be destitute." Margaret's heart sank as she realized how damning the evidence must sound. The gold coin had been her grandmother's wedding ring, sold to a jeweler for traveling money, but explaining that would only make her story sound more elaborate and desperate. "You see," Webb said with satisfaction. "Classic confidence game. Woman targets wealthy Mark, manufactures a sob story to gain his sympathy, then works her way into his confidence to learn about his business interests. Probably planned to clean him out and disappear before anyone was the wiser." Jonathan's face had gone pale, and Margaret could see him reassessing every moment of their brief relationship through this new lens of suspicion. Had her story been too perfectly calculated to tug at his heartstrings? Had her apparent intelligence about business matters been just a little too convenient? Had she played him for a fool from the very beginning? "It wasn't like that," Margaret said desperately. But even to her own ears, the protest sounded weak and rehearsed. "Jonathan, you have to believe me. Everything I told you was true." But as she watched doubt cloud his features, Margaret realized that the truth had become irrelevant. The evidence against her was circumstantial but convincing, and her own past actions had created a pattern that seemed to confirm every suspicion about her character. She was trapped not just by iron bars, but by the weight of choices that had seemed necessary at the time but now appeared calculating and criminal. Outside, the crowd in the street was growing larger, drawn by the novelty of a real criminal investigation in their small town. Margaret could hear fragments of conversation drifting through the window, speculation about her crimes, theories about her methods, satisfied commentary about justice finally being served. She closed her eyes and held Catherine closer, knowing that whatever happened next would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the innocent child who had no choice but to trust in her mother's decisions, no matter how badly those decisions had turned out. The courtroom filled with the sound of shuffling boots and hushed conversations as what seemed like half of Silver Creek crowded into the makeshift legal proceedings taking place in the hotel's dining room. Judge Samuel Morrison, a weathered man who traveled the circuit bringing frontier justice to remote settlements, sat behind a table that still bore water stains from the previous night's dinner service. Margaret stood between two deputies, Catherine sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the chaos surrounding them. She'd spent the night in jail listening to Jonathan pace in the adjacent cell, his footsteps marking time like a clock counting down to disaster. Now, in the harsh light of morning, she faced the possibility of years in prison while her daughter grew up in an orphanage. "Mrs. Margaret O'Brien," Judge Morrison's voice carried the authority of decades spent pronouncing judgment on frontier lawbreakers. "You stand accused of theft, fraud, and abandonment of legal obligations. How do you plead?" Margaret opened her mouth to speak, then hesitated as she caught sight of a familiar face in the crowded room. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, her gray hair neatly braided and her traveling dress dusty from hard riding. The woman's presence hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her former employer had traveled hundreds of miles to testify against her, to confirm the charges that would destroy any hope of freedom. Guilty, Margaret said quietly, the word falling like a stone into still water. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence. Mrs. O'Brien, I want to be certain you understand the charges against you. You're admitting to stealing money from a charitable organization. Margaret lifted her chin, meeting the judge's stern gaze with what remained of her dignity. I took money that wasn't formally approved by the organization's board. I used false papers to secure transportation. I left Missouri with unpaid debts. She paused, then added, but I saved 3 children's lives with that money, and I'd do it again. The courtroom erupted in surprised conversation, but Margaret's attention was fixed on Mrs. Henderson, who had risen from her seat with an expression of shock and indignation that seemed directed not at Margaret, but at the proceedings themselves. Your Honor, Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife through butter. I demand the right to testify on behalf of this woman. Judge Morrison frowned, clearly unprepared for such an interruption. Ma'am, this is highly irregular. If you wish to testify, you'll need to wait your turn and— I will not wait, Mrs. Henderson declared, marching forward with the determination of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and raised 6 children on the frontier. This entire proceeding is based on lies and misunderstandings, and I won't sit quietly while an innocent woman is railroaded by men who don't know the first thing about what really happened. Deputy Webb stepped forward with obvious annoyance. Your Honor, this woman is here to confirm the charges against the defendant. She's the one who reported the theft in the first place. Mrs. Henderson's laugh was sharp as broken glass. I most certainly did not report any theft, you fool. I came here to testify that Margaret O'Brien is the finest woman I've ever known, and that every penny she took was given to her with my blessing and gratitude. The words hit the courtroom like thunder, and Margaret felt her knees go weak with shock. She stared at Mrs. Henderson, unable to process what she was hearing. But the warrant, the charges, were filed by my brother-in-law after I refused to marry him, Mrs. Henderson announced, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent room. Harold Simmons has been trying to get his hands on my late husband's property for years, and when I turned down his proposal, he decided to punish me by going after the woman he blamed for filling my head with independent ideas. Judge Morrison leaned forward, his weathered face creased with concentration. Are you saying these charges are false? I'm saying they're vindictive lies told by a bitter man who can't stand the thought of a woman making her own decisions, Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. Margaret O'Brien nursed my 3 children through scarlet fever when every doctor in Springfield said they would die. She worked day and night for weeks, asking for nothing in return. When I insisted on paying her from my emergency fund, she tried to refuse the money. Margaret felt the world spinning around her as the truth finally emerged. Harold Simmons, Mrs. Henderson's brother-in-law, who had been pressuring her to remarry so he could control her deceased husband's property. She remembered the man's angry visits during the children's illness, his loud complaints about the money being wasted on medical care, his obvious resentment of Margaret's influence over his sister-in-law's decisions. Furthermore, Mrs. Henderson continued, pulling a folded document from her reticule, I have here a letter from the Ladies' Aid Society Board, written after I explained the circumstances of Margaret's payment. They not only approved the emergency disbursement, they voted to name her an honorary member in recognition of her service to our community. The deputy marshal's face had gone red with embarrassment and anger. This is all very touching, but we still have charges of fraud and filed by a man who has no legal standing to represent either the Ladies' Aid Society or my family's interests. Mrs. Henderson interrupted smoothly. I've brought my attorney from Springfield to explain the finer points of law to anyone who cares to listen. As if summoned by her words, a dignified man in a black suit stepped forward from the crowd. Margaret recognized him as Jefferson Whitmore, one of Springfield's most respected lawyers, and a man whose reputation for honesty was legendary throughout Missouri. Your Honor, Whitmore said formally, I represent Mrs. Henderson and the Ladies' Aid Society of Springfield. The charges against Mrs. O'Brien were filed without proper authority and are completely without merit. My clients are prepared to provide sworn testimony that every action taken by the defendant was not only legal, but commendable. Judge Morrison sat back in his chair, his expression shifting from stern authority to puzzled frustration. Mr. Webb, what exactly is going on here? If these charges were filed improperly, the deputy marshal looked like a man who had just watched his career crumble into dust. Your Honor, we received official complaints through proper channels. If there was some kind of mistake, there was no mistake, a new voice called from the back of the room, and Margaret's blood turned to ice as she recognized Harold Simmons pushing through the crowd. He was a large man with the kind of bluster that came from bullying people smaller and weaker than himself, and his face was twisted with rage at seeing his carefully laid plans falling apart. Margaret O'Brien is a thief and a homewrecker, Simmons declared loudly. She poisoned my sister-in-law's mind against her family, convinced her to waste money on charity cases, and then fled like the criminal she is when honest folks started asking questions. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun, and Margaret realized that even if the legal charges were dropped, the damage to her reputation might be irreparable. But as she looked around the crowded room, she saw something unexpected in the faces of Silver Creek's residents. Not judgment or condemnation, but growing anger at a man who would use the law to persecute a woman for the crime of showing compassion. And in the front row, Jonathan Blackwood sat with his fists clenched and his dark eyes blazing with a fury that promised Harold Simmons had made a very dangerous enemy. Harold Simmons's fist connected with Jonathan's jaw with a sound like an axe hitting green wood, sending the Boston gentleman stumbling backward into the hotel dining room's makeshift jury box. The courtroom erupted into chaos as chairs overturned and spectators scrambled to avoid the suddenly violent confrontation between two men whose hatred had just boiled over into something raw and dangerous. You think your fancy words and big city money can protect that scheming woman? Simmons roared, advancing on Jonathan with the lumbering grace of an angry bear. She's made fools of all of you, just like she made a fool of my sister-in-law. Jonathan wiped blood from his split lip and straightened his coat with the careful dignity of a man who had been raised never to show weakness, even when facing an opponent who outweighed him by 50 pounds. The only fool here is a man who would use the law to pursue a personal vendetta against a defenseless woman. The second punch came faster than the first, but this time Jonathan was ready. He ducked under Simmons's wild swing and responded with a precise uppercut that caught the larger man under the chin, snapping his head back with satisfying force. Margaret had never seen violence up close before, and the sight of two grown men fighting over her honor filled her with a mixture of terror and unexpected pride. Judge Morrison was shouting for order and threatening to hold everyone in contempt, but his voice was lost in the noise of a frontier courtroom that had suddenly transformed into something closer to a saloon brawl. Deputy Webb tried to intervene, but Harrison Caldwell stepped smoothly into his path with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to manipulate any situation to his advantage. Gentlemen, Caldwell called out in his most reasonable voice, though Margaret noticed he made no real effort to stop the fight. Surely we can resolve this matter without resorting to violence. But Margaret was watching Mrs. Henderson, who sat calmly in the front row with the satisfied expression of a woman whose plans were unfolding exactly as she had hoped. There was something calculating in the older woman's eyes that made Margaret suddenly wonder if this entire confrontation had been orchestrated from the beginning. Simmons connected with a wild haymaker that sent Jonathan crashing into a table, scattering papers and water glasses across the floor. But instead of staying down, Jonathan rolled to his feet with surprising agility and grabbed a wooden chair, wielding it like a lion tamer facing a particularly aggressive beast. Harold Simmons. Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the chaos like a church bell calling sinners to repentance. You always were a bully and a coward, picking fights with men half your size and persecuting women who couldn't defend themselves. The words hit Simmons like a physical blow, stopping his advance toward Jonathan as effectively as if she'd drawn a gun on him. Sarah, you don't understand what this woman has done to our family. I understand perfectly, Mrs. Henderson replied, rising from her chair with regal dignity. I understand that you've been trying to control my life and my property ever since my husband died. I understand that you filed false charges against Margaret because you knew she was the one person who encouraged me to stand up to your bullying. And I understand that you're about to face the consequences of those actions. Margaret felt her breath catch as she finally understood the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about Mrs. Henderson breaking free from years of manipulation and intimidation by a man who had used family obligation to control her choices. Attorney Whitmore stepped forward with a leather portfolio thick with documents. Mr. Simmons, I have here sworn statements from 12 members of the Springfield community attesting to your pattern of harassment toward my client. I also have documentation of your attempts to forge power of attorney documents that would give you control over Mrs. Henderson's property. The revelation hit the courtroom like lightning, and Margaret saw Simmons's face go pale beneath his angry flush. That's a lie, he blustered, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. Furthermore, Whitmore continued relentlessly, I have evidence that you bribed a clerk in the county courthouse to file the charges against Mrs. O'Brien using falsified complaints. That's a federal crime, Mr. Simmons, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Judge Morrison had finally restored order to his courtroom, though Jonathan and Simmons still faced each other across an overturned table like gunfighters waiting for the signal to draw. Mr. Whitmore, these are serious accusations. Do you have proof of these claims? I do, Your Honor. Whitmore opened his portfolio and began laying out documents with the methodical precision of a man who had prepared for this moment for months. Bank records showing payments to courthouse clerks. Forged signatures on legal documents. Witness statements describing Mr. Simmons's threats against anyone who supported Mrs. Henderson's independence. Margaret realized she was holding her breath as the true scope of the conspiracy against her became clear. Simmons hadn't just filed false charges. He'd created an elaborate web of corruption designed to destroy anyone who threatened his control over his sister-in-law's life and property. But even as relief began to flood through her, Margaret noticed something troubling in Jonathan's expression. He was looking at her with a mixture of confusion and hurt that suggested her vindication had raised new questions rather than answering old ones. Margaret, Jonathan said quietly, his voice barely audible above the courtroom's buzz of conversation. If Mrs. Henderson knew you were innocent, why didn't she contact you months ago? Why let you suffer all this time? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Mrs. Henderson's eyes met hers across the crowded room, and in that moment, Margaret saw something that made her stomach drop like a stone thrown into deep water. Because, Mrs. Henderson said with quiet satisfaction, I needed Margaret to be far enough away from Springfield to be safe when I finally made my move against Harold, and I needed her to be in exactly the right place to meet exactly the right person. Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet as she realized that her months of suffering, her desperate journey west, even her encounter with Jonathan, none of it had been accidental. She had been a pawn in a game whose rules she was only now beginning to understand. You planned this? Margaret whispered, the words barely audible. All of it. Mrs. Henderson's smile was gentle but implacable. My dear girl, sometimes the only way to save someone is to let them save themselves. And sometimes, the best way to bring good people together is to put them in circumstances where they can recognize each other's true worth. The courtroom had gone silent, everyone straining to hear this quiet conversation that seemed to hold the key to understanding everything that had happened. Even Judge Morrison leaned forward, his weathered face creased with fascination at this unexpected turn in an already bizarre case. Margaret looked at Jonathan, seeing her own confusion reflected in his dark eyes. They had found each other in what seemed like chance encounter born of desperation and kindness. But if that meeting had been orchestrated by someone else's design, what did that mean for the feelings they had discovered? What did it mean for the future they had tentatively begun to imagine together? And in the back of the courtroom, Harrison Caldwell watched the proceedings with the calculating expression of a man who was already planning how to use this new information to his own advantage. The winter wind of 1870 whistled through the gaps in the little schoolhouse walls, but Margaret barely noticed the cold as she watched 23 children of various ages bent over their slates, practicing the multiplication tables she'd written on the blackboard. 6 months had passed since the dramatic courtroom scene in Silver Creek, and the simple rhythm of teaching had helped heal wounds she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Catherine, now a robust 8-month-old with her mother's green eyes and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone she met, played contentedly in a basket near Margaret's desk, babbling to a wooden horse that Jonathan had carved for her before everything had changed between them. "Mrs. O'Brien?" 10-year-old Timothy Fletcher raised his hand, his freckled face scrunched with concentration. "I don't understand why we have to learn about numbers when most folks around here just dig for silver or raise cattle." Margaret smiled, remembering asking her own teacher a similar question years ago in Missouri. "Because numbers tell stories, Timothy. They tell us how much silver we've found, how many cattle we can feed through winter, how much money we need to build better lives for our families." Through the schoolhouse's single window, she could see Silver Creek's main street bustling with the activity of a town that was growing faster than anyone had expected. The silver mine was producing well, bringing prosperity that attracted new families almost weekly. Margaret's school had started with 12 students and now served children from 3 neighboring settlements. The job had come through Mrs. Henderson's influence, though Margaret still wasn't entirely sure how she felt about accepting help from the woman who had manipulated her life so thoroughly. The school board had been skeptical about hiring an unmarried mother, but Mrs. Henderson's glowing letters of recommendation had overcome their objections. A knock at the schoolhouse door interrupted her thoughts, and Margaret looked up to see a familiar silhouette through the frosted glass. Her heart performed the same uncomfortable skip it had been doing for months whenever she glimpsed Jonathan around town, though their encounters had become increasingly rare and stiffly polite. "Children, please continue with your arithmetic," Margaret said, smoothing her skirt as she moved to answer the door. "I'll be right back." Jonathan stood on the schoolhouse steps, his expensive coat dusted with snow and his breath forming white clouds in the crisp air. He looked thinner than she remembered, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "Jonathan," Margaret said quietly, stepping outside and pulling the door closed behind her. "This is unexpected. I'm leaving Silver Creek," he said without preamble, his voice carefully neutral. "My business here is finished, and there are obligations in Boston that require my attention." Margaret had known this moment would come eventually, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. "When?" "Tomorrow morning. The eastbound stage." He paused, studying her face with the intensity that had always made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. "I wanted to say goodbye properly, and to give you this." He held out a thick envelope sealed with red wax, and Margaret recognized the expensive paper and formal presentation of legal documents. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted it, wondering what final complication was about to enter her life. "What is it?" "Deed to the schoolhouse and the land it sits on," Jonathan replied, "along with enough money to ensure your salary for the next 5 years, regardless of what the school board decides." Margaret stared at the envelope as if it contained a snake. "I can't accept this. It's too much, and after everything that happened." "After everything that happened, you deserve security," Jonathan interrupted. "You and Catherine both. This isn't charity, Margaret. It's justice." The words hung between them like a challenge, heavy with all the things they'd never quite said to each other. Margaret wanted to ask why he was really leaving, whether it had anything to do with Harrison Caldwell's threats or his family's demands. She wanted to tell him that she'd spent 6 months replaying their brief time together, wondering if the connection she'd felt had been real or just the product of desperate circumstances. But the careful distance in his expression warned her that such questions would not be welcome. "The children will miss you," she said instead, which was true but not nearly the whole truth. "You've been generous with donations to the school. The children are lucky to have you as their teacher," Jonathan replied. "You've built something important here, Margaret. Something that will last long after the silver runs out and the miners move on to the next strike." Through the schoolhouse window, Margaret could see her students starting to fidget, their attention wandering from their arithmetic to the drama unfolding outside. She knew she should go back inside, maintain the professional distance that was expected of an unmarried schoolteacher. but part of her wanted to grab Jonathan's coat and demand answers to questions that had been haunting her for months. "Jonathan," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the confusion that had been eating at her since the trial. "Do you think, if we had met under different circumstances, without all the deception and manipulation, do you think we might have?" "I think," Jonathan said carefully, "that we met exactly when and how we were supposed to meet. And I think that sometimes the most important connections in our lives come through the most unexpected paths." It wasn't quite an answer, but it was close enough to one that Margaret felt some of the tension she'd been carrying begin to ease. Whatever had passed between them, whether it was genuine feeling or circumstantial emotion, it had led them both to discoveries about themselves that might not have happened any other way. "Will you write?" she asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. "I mean, to let us know you're well." Jonathan's smile was the first genuine expression she'd seen from him in months. "I'd like that, and perhaps you could send word about the school's progress. I'd hate to think my investment wasn't being properly managed." The teasing note in his voice reminded Margaret of their early conversations, when the future had seemed full of possibilities neither of them had dared to name. For a moment, she almost asked him to stay, to give whatever was between them a chance to grow into something real and lasting. But before she could find the courage to speak, the moment passed. Jonathan touched his hat in farewell and walked away down the snow-dusted street, his figure growing smaller until he disappeared around the corner toward the hotel. Margaret stood on the schoolhouse steps for a long moment, watching the place where he'd vanished and listening to the sounds of Silver Creek going about its daily business. Inside, Catherine began to fuss, and her students were probably wondering where their teacher had gone. She looked down at the envelope in her hands, feeling its weight and understanding that it represented more than just financial security. It was Jonathan's way of saying that he believed in her ability to build a life worth living, regardless of whether that life included him. Taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, Margaret tucked the envelope into her apron pocket and went back inside to teach her students about the power of numbers to tell the stories of their lives.